Today I'd like to talk about the scientific revolution. It represents a platform on which the modern world develops and a major change from the way things were looked at in ancient and medieval times. In ancient times there was a geographer named Ptolemy, and Ptolemy developed an idea of the universe which came to be known as the Ptolemaic view of the universe. The church, as it develops, will adopt Ptolemy's idea about the universe and make it its own. Ptolemy lived in the 2nd century. He was a Greek astronomer, geographer, and his view of the universe was geocentric, a geocentric view, that is, with the earth in the center of the universe. Now, what's going to happen at the time here of the scientific revolution is that we will see what is sometimes called the Copernican revolution. The Copernican revolution is going to challenge the view of Ptolemy, as you can see here with the earth in the center on this graph. And it's going to put it into a form which, of course, we now accept, which is the heliocentric. That is, with the sun in the center. So you might think of this like a set of clear mixing bowls with all the stars and the planets and everything painted on the inside of those clear bowls. This is a geometric view. The earth is in the center. Those bowls are spinning, so everything is spinning around the earth. Everything is centered upon the earth. Copernicus, in his calculations, determines that that model is not correct. That, in fact, the sun is in the middle, and that the earth is rotating around it. Now, Copernicus, as you see pictured here, will write all of his findings down in a book entitled on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. And so we see this was published in 1543. Now, if you look carefully at the dates of Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, you'll notice this is published in the year that he died, and that is no accident. He had this published in the year he was died because he knew that this would be very controversial, and he basically did not want to have to deal with the controversy. He claimed that the sun was in the center. Now, of course, many people rejected his ideas, but others accepted it, and this is what led to the Copernican revolution, a re-looking at the entire universe. But the other thing that it led to was a rethinking of presuppositions. If, in fact, people had been mistaken for, let's say, 1,500 years or more about the positioning of the earth in the universe, that it was no longer in the center, what else were people wrong about? The church had accepted this because it seemed to fit their model. The earth was in the center. The earth is most important to God. God created the earth in the center, placed His Son on it, and so forth, to be our Savior. And all of these things seemed to fit. And so the church adopted this theory and made it their doctrine. And that's what created the problems here for Copernicus, really for those who followed Copernicus later on. I thought you might like to see this. This is an image of Copernicus that was generated by a reconstruction by using his skull that they found in a cathedral. And they compared the skull then with a hair that was found in one of his books, and they determined this really was Copernicus. So this is probably as close as we'll ever get to seeing what Copernicus actually looked like. Now, many people were going to ignore Copernicus's ideas because they were so controversial, but one person who will follow them and develop them further is a man named Kepler, Johannes Kepler. He was a brilliant mathematician, and he is able to develop laws of planetary motion based upon Copernicus's ideas. Now, his calculations confirmed what Copernicus had said, that the sun was in the center. He did make a modification to Copernicus's model there. If you notice, Copernicus's model had circular orbits of the planets. Kepler said, no, they're really elliptical in shape. Now another famous scientist who will take the ideas of Copernicus, and that will get him into a lot of trouble, is Galileo, who lives 1564 to 1642. Galileo is famous for constructing a telescope. This is a reflection telescope where he looks through the lenses and sees it that way. Excuse me, that's a refraction telescope. With this telescope, he discovered the mountains on the moon. And he really did study the moon. He looked at a lot of things, including Jupiter, where he found that there were 4 moons of Jupiter that he could see through his telescope. And so he's really exploring what he could see through his telescope. Now, another thing that Galileo did, which I do not recommend, is he actually used his telescope to look at the sun. And with it, he saw solar flares, he saw sunspots, and he saw many things on the surface of the sun. Now, of course, this eventually will lead him to become blind because of the radiation that he placed into his eyes by looking at the sun. Galileo also determined that the universe, that is what's outside of Earth, I guess what we would say our atmosphere, is not of the same stuff as the Earth. That in fact, it's something different there. It's what we would call a vacuum. There's really a void. There's nothing there. He writes all of this down in a work that's called The Starry Messenger in 1610. And The Starry Messenger then, after it's published, will get him into a lot of trouble. He will eventually be arrested and put on trial by the church and found guilty of Copernicanism in 1633. Now, it'll take a while because he publishes this in 1610, and then later on he says, no, I don't really believe what's in that, and then he finally says, yes, I do. And because of that, he is thrown into jail. Now, another key figure in the scientific revolution is Isaac Newton, Sir Isaac Newton. Interesting man who attends Cambridge University in England. He's from England in 1661. And 8 years later, after he began his study at Cambridge, he is actually named chair of the mathematics department at Cambridge. So that is quite a quick achievement for Isaac Newton. Now, the idea of the scientific revolution is that ideas are based upon what others have done. And so Isaac Newton would be clear to point out that his achievements were based upon the work of others, like Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler. He comes up with many great discoveries. For example, he examines light and determines that light is a mixture of pure colors, like the rainbow, exactly, Roy G. Biv. And that light also functions like particles traveling in straight lines at great speed. He actually develops the idea of calculus, so you may thank him for that or not, using concepts of time and infinity and putting it into mathematical ideas. And he's the one who develops a new kind of telescope called the reflection telescope, which uses mirrors to help actually magnify things even more than a refraction telescope. He also comes up with several laws of motion that we won't go into right now, including the law of gravity, where in these laws of motion we still use today in our sort of real-world, everyday life. He's going to write all these things down in his book entitled Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, sometimes just called his Principia, in 1687. Now, I think it's interesting to note that Isaac Newton believed that God held the entire universe together, and that was why the universe was systematic. God set objects into motion, and later on we'll see that some people are going to begin to reject God and see the world as a machine, using Isaac Newton's ideas, but rejecting his belief in God. So just to conclude, let me say this, that I think we can see from the scientific revolution that science is based upon the idea of a consistent universe. That is the assumption that Newton and others made. And that assumption was based upon their idea that God had created the universe. God was consistent, therefore the universe is consistent. Because most religions, let's say of the Greeks and the Romans and so forth, saw their gods as being capricious. That is, they might do anything. You never knew what they were going to do. They might be in a bad mood. One day do something they wouldn't do the next. But God of the Bible is consistent. Separating God from this kind of idea is going to lead people to skepticism and eventually will lead them to doubt and despair.